Obsidian Entertainment, the makers of Grounded, The Outer Worlds, and Fallout New Vegas, are currently hard at work on another game. This game is called Avowed. You might even equate it to being Obsidian's very own Elder Scrolls. Why is that, you ask? While it may be a new title, it's also part of an already existing game series called Pillars of Eternity, not to be mistaken with Path of Exile. That's a completely different game. Avowed has a different name, and it might be because the gameplay is vastly different from its predecessors. Avowed is going to be in a very similar style to the Elder Scrolls, and that's a big departure from the games it comes from. From what we've seen so far, it appears to be a single-player, open-world, choice-driven RPG with a first-person perspective. I'm a huge fan of the Elder Scrolls in that genre of games, so I'm very much looking forward to playing Avowed when it releases next year in 2024. That said, I know next to nothing about the world it hails from. I wanted to get to see and know where Avowed would be taking place, to have another series to look forward to and understand the references it'll no doubt make. That's why we'll be taking a look at the first in the series here. The first, Pillars of Eternity. Being made during a time when money was a bit tighter and harder to acquire, Pillars of Eternity was a crowdfunded game on Kickstarter back in September 2012 from over 77,000 people. After being in hard development, the game released in 2015 to good success. It even received some awards that year. Pillars of Eternity was inspired by Infinity Engine games like Baldur's Gate and even Icewind Dale. And when I say Baldur's Gate, I don't mean that new game. I mean the original two games made by the BioWare of old.
I was hoping you would grant me the honor of cutting down these impertinent mortals.
Yeah, those games. The game did well enough to have the developers make a DLC story for it called The White March, which released in two separate installments of parts 1 and 2. Not only did it get a DLC, but it also spawned a sequel by the name Pillars of Eternity 2: Deadfire. I'll be getting to the sequel another time. For now, let's hop into the first game proper. Welcome to the incredibly intriguing world of Pillars of Eternity. One of the biggest things of note about the Pillars games is that they're set in their own world developed by Obsidian. From how the setting is, to the Pantheon, to how physics work, it's done in a traditional fantasy setting with their own spin on it. To say it's inspired by Baldur's Gate isn't calling this series a knockoff in any way. This is Obsidian's own take in that genre of game. The first thing players will see when they click New Game is the various difficulties. You can go as easy as Story Time, which focuses specifically on giving you the story over the challenging gameplay, all the way up to Path of the Damned. Now, this game is pretty tough normally for anyone that isn't familiar with this style of gameplay. Even easy is actually pretty hard, so Path of the Damned is if you're a straight up masochist. There are also two different modifiers you can turn on called Expert Mode, which basically doesn't hold your hand in any way, and Trial of Iron. If you get a game over, your file is deleted, so good luck. The next thing people will notice is how the story starts. It doesn't start with a flashy cutscene or a world-ending threat. What you're greeted with is a picture and a narrator speaking on what your character is doing at this moment before you control them for the remainder of the game. It's then you're face to face with the character creator. What they have for character creations is both a lot and not a lot at the same time. What I mean by this is you have multiple races, multiple sub-races inside each race, many classes, backstories, place of birth, and talents to choose from. What you don't have a lot of variety in is what your character looks like. The reason for that is you won't end up seeing your character very well during the game anyway. We'll get to that in just a bit. Let's back up and talk about all the things I listed earlier. There are 6 races to choose from: humans, Almawa, dwarves, elves, Orlans, and godlike. So we have a basic understanding of what humans, dwarves, and elves are. So let's go over the unique races in the world of Eora. Almawa are towering beings that have a strong connection to water. Orlans are very small and are outcast by a lot of Deerwood in society. Finally, the godlike. The godlike are a very unique race idea from Obsidian. They can be born into any of the other races, but have been blessed with physical appearances similar to the gods. They can't wear any headgear due to the shapes of their heads. Each race has their own racial bonuses to stats, like humans get +1 to resolve and might. Almawa get might +2, dwarves get might +2, dexterity -1, and constitution +1. Elves get dexterity and perception +1. Orlans get resolve +1, might -1, and perception +2. And finally, godlike get dexterity and intellect +1. If you're wondering why you saw 3 stat changes for some of the races where most only had 2, is because the racial stats work in a +2 capacity. If you subtract 1 from any stat, then you have 3 points to work with in growing other stats, thus bringing them in line with the other races at +2. While +1 and 2 might not seem like a big number, stats and levels really matter in this game. There is no level 100 that you typically see in a lot of current RPGs. Pillars of Eternity runs on a similar idea to Baldur's Gate in that way, where the max level is 12. If you own the DLC, you can get up to level 16. A minor increase such as +1 to any stat is actually really great growth. If you wanted to equate it to a level 100 scale, you could say that every level in Pillars of Eternity is equal to gaining over 6 levels at once. Imagine going up against a boss that decimates you and your team. Then you gain a single level through questing and absolutely dumpster on them. That's because you just outleveled that boss in a big way instantly. Alright, I sidetracked there. Let's get back to the character creator. Once you click on any of the races, you're introduced to the various sub-races in each of the races. This will not only change how your character can look, but it also changes a bit of their backstory via where their people came from. Wild Orlans look like literal trolls. Once you choose the race and sub-race, it's time to choose your class. And there's a whopping 11 classes. They all get different skills and talents they can use, so they're all viable in a variety of ways. Pairing them with other classes from the various companions really changes how you approach combat. You have close quarters classes like Paladin and Fighter, support classes like Priest and Chanter, and even ranged classes like Wizard and Ranger. After choosing the class, you get to choose their starting abilities and oh, Ranger gets a pet ally! Now that you've chosen your class, it's over to the attributes we go. The game starts your character out with an average of 10 for each stat, with some being different based on your race choice from earlier. You have another 15 points you can play around with and add into the board. The gold stars are highly recommended attributes to put points into for your class, and the silver stars are recommended for the same reason, just not as highly as the gold. These attributes will stay at whatever you put them at through the rest of the game. You can boost them up with different pieces of gear you can equip, so you can influence it further with that. Attributes are mainly used for dialogue and storybook cutscene moments. If you have enough points in one attribute, it'll open up certain options for you in those fields as you play through the game. With attributes out of the way, it's on to culture, otherwise known as where your character is from. Each location has its own story and lore tied to it, so pick which one is most interesting to you. Also, your character's starting equipment changes depending on each location. Now you can pick your background. Your options here change depending on what class you pick. You get a short idea of what your character could have done, and it gives you different stat bonuses with it. Now we get to the appearance tab. You can change the colors of your skin and clothing, and depending on your race, you can have facial hair, change your face with pre-made heads, and choose a hairstyle. The options here are quite limited, but as I said earlier, you're not going to be seeing your character like this very often anyway. 99 portraits to choose from, and you can change this whenever you want, so don't feel strapped down with it. The portraits are there so you know you're clicking on your character specifically. Now choose your voice, and let's head out into the world of Eora. Now that you've created your character, it's time we shift over to the gameplay section. As you can see here, your view is from an isometric perspective. That's an aerial view at an angle. You can't move your camera view at all, so this is what you'll see. It's not bad. The gameplay is centered around this viewpoint, so it's not like you'll have to turn it all the time anyway. That said, there will be times when you have your characters, or the enemies, behind something like a tree or a wall. During those few times, it can be hard to see what's happening. That also brings us to the fog of war. You see that viewable circle around your character? Everything outside that circle is darkened off. That's your view range. Looking at the areas outside of that range shows them as black, so you can't see what's out there at all. Movement is key here. It's unit-based movement. You have to select the units you want first, and then click on your screen where you want them to move to. You can move your camera around by either bringing your mouse to the edge of the screen in the direction you want to move in, or using the arrow keys by default. I personally keybound that part to my WASD keys. So much easier since there's a lot of buttons for use right there. As you move around, you unlock sight in the areas you walk in. They still get darker when they're not in your general field of vision, but now you can see the map in that spot. The only thing you can't see are objects and characters in those areas now. Holding the tab key will show you all selectable objects in your general vicinity. This is supremely helpful when searching around the various areas for loot to plunder. It can also show the nameplates of NPCs in the area, both enemies and allies. Let's talk about combat. When you come across an enemy, you'll see they have a red circle under them. There are green circles under you and your allies. This indicates who's an ally and who's an enemy. Seeing the colors will help you see how many enemies are left you need to take out before you can move on. When starting combat, the game will automatically pause for you. you can pause and unpause with the spacebar whenever you need. This will allow you precious time to issue orders to your team, as there is strategy involved here. If you don't pause it, everything plays out in real time. Your characters will auto-attack enemies that hit them first, or enemies that you select for them to fight. When an enemy falls, they can either start attacking the nearest enemy, or you'll see 3 dots above their head telling you that they have no orders. All characters under your control have talents that you can use. These talents not only vary from class to class, but they can be talents that you get back between combat engagements, or through resting. They have a limited amount of uses, so keeping that in mind will help. Classes like Wizard and Priest get a lot of spells of varying levels. Because of this, the amount of uses for these spells is tied to the level of spell they're attached to. Think of it as balancing how classes work in the game, since they have a ton of different spells they can use, whereas my Ranger had like 5 talents. Regardless, each class has its own advantages to bring to the table. A fighter with a sword and shield can be a tank of the group, rushing into combat first and keeping the enemy's attention on them instead of the rest of your companions. While that's going on, you can have a ranger whittling that same enemy down faster, safely from a distance with their bow. Wizards are huge damage dealers. Some of their spells take time to cast, and when they hit hard. Adversely, they're very squishy when it comes to getting hit. It's why going into a game like this with a good team composition is key for a lot of engagements. That's not to say it's impossible to get through it without a full group. You can get a party of up to 6 characters. Let's say they're all rangers. Every one of them will have a pet, which brings that number up to 12. But something that is completely possible to do is to actually go through the game with only one character, your character. People have done runs of the game on something they call Triple Crown Solo. That's the hardest difficulty with both modifiers on and going through the game with only their character. Straight up masochists, I say. But I respect the grind. They are far better than I. My personal team composition was my Ranger with a Fighter for tanking, a Paladin for heals and co-tanking, a Priest for buffs and healing, a Chanter for buffs and summons, and finally a Wizard for straight up deleting enemies. I tried to go with a catch-all kind of team, and boy, I can tell you how fast things can fall apart when you have even one of your characters go down. Speaking of going down, there's a whole system for that. Your characters can straight up die in this. Characters have 2 different visual meters in combat. They have endurance and health points. Endurance is primarily used in the current combat engagement that you're in, and is represented by the character's portrait getting more red from the top down. HP is the thin bar on the left. If a character runs out of endurance, their portrait will go completely red, and they will be knocked out on the field. This will give them some debuffs that can go away with resting. But let's say that a character is knocked out. They can still be attacked by enemies, so you'll see their red turning to gray from the top down instead. If that hits the bottom, the character is killed. Endurance equates to a small portion of the HP. After being knocked out, HP is all they have left to stay alive. Once a character is killed, they're gone for good. This adds a certain type of urgency to combat when you see a character get knocked out. In these instances, I'll say that the pause button is your friend. Thankfully, there are characters like Paladins and Priests that can get a resurrect spell, bringing the character back up from the KO state, but they will still have their debuffs. There's always a risk to engaging the enemy in this game, and it adds a sense of permanence to the choices you make in the heat of battle. As you move your characters, they also go in a certain formation. You can change where your characters are located in that formation by clicking and dragging their portraits around with the others. You can also straight up change the formation itself, or even make your own type of formation. Knowing where your characters are at as you bring them closer to the enemies will determine who connects with the enemy first. If an enemy spots you from one of your flanks, the middle of the group will be targeted first. One tougher aspect of combat is that your characters can't just pass through each other. If you're in a skinny hallway, or just walking through a doorway, you're going to need to move your characters around in order for everyone to engage the enemies. The characters will try for a bit to reach the enemy, but if they can't find a path after a bit, they go into that 3-dot state where they need a new order. Environments with smaller choke points are not only beneficial sometimes, but they also work against you. Also, trying to get your melee-only companions past everyone is sometimes a pain. That brings up a negative point in the combat sequences here. The AI pathing is actually pretty bad. It works for enemies because they're typically spread out enough or situated in a good way in open areas. When it comes to your small group, they'll sometimes run into trees and objects instead of reaching the enemy they were ordered to target. This happens even when there's a clear path around the object. They just don't understand that for some reason. I had to physically click them around the object in question in order to engage. Sadly, that's sometime I could have been planning a new strategy or making Aloth cast a huge spell or something. That said, it's not like this happens all the time. In open areas, your characters won't be running into choke points or trees that they need help getting around. There are quite a lot of open areas. The straight up combat and strategy is a strong point to the Pillars games. But that brings us to an issue that does happen all the time. You can order certain troops to attack different enemies. They'll run up to that enemy, but if they're hit or get too close to another enemy, they'll instead target that one rather than the one you ordered. This honestly happens far too often in the game. It only adds more frustration to engagements than anything else. When I order Adair to go fight a specific enemy, he should not be fighting one 2 steps away from him after I ordered him. It kind of defeats the purpose of ordering your troops when that can happen whenever. Outside of that, the combat is both fun and tough. As your characters level up, they'll get much stronger. More talents to choose from, how they fight, using different weapon types, setting traps, it's all there. And like I said earlier, leveling up really matters in Pillars of Eternity. Gaining just 1 level really strengthens your character. Let's talk about the leveling system. As I stated before, 16 is the max level in this game if you have the White March DLC, both parts specifically. There are differences to what you gain from level ups depending on if it's an odd or an even number. After you level up, no matter if it's an odd or an even, you get 6 additional points that you can put into 5 different skills: stealth, athletics, lore, mechanics, and survival. All of these skills affect gameplay in different ways. Stealth makes it take longer before enemies will notice you. Mechanics help you notice traps on the ground as well as disarming them. Survival will let you choose certain bonuses after you rest. Just some examples there. Not only do they affect your normal gameplay, but they can be brought up in certain story moments as well. They can change up the outcome to make what you're reading be more successful. On an elevator full of enemies with the elevator stopped, if you have someone with a sufficient number of points in mechanics, they can get it fixed up and get you away from there. Need to eavesdrop quietly? Having a good amount of points into stealth can make it so you can hear more information needed for your quest, and so on. Stuff like that helps to make your choices in how your character's level be more impactful. So the way leveling these skills works is it takes a certain amount of points to advance to the next rank. They all start out with 1 point needed, and you get 6 per level. When you rank one of them up, the points needed will be increased by 1. In this case, it makes it to 2 points for the next rank. It'll continue working like that all the way up to level 16. So what happens when you need 7 points to rank up? Well, when that happens, you can simply skip ranking up and your points will carry over to the next level. That 6 points becomes 12, allowing you to rank that up again. Every little bit of this game has choices that you can make, and they feel more impactful in how they're implemented. That's fantastic. After ranking skills up, that's when it's dependent on whether it's an odd or an even level. On even levels, you can choose from different talents. These talents are from 4 tabs: class, offensive, defensive, and utility. The class tab gives you talents that are specific to your class only. Offense can allow you to better use different weapon types. Defensive will help make your character a bit tougher to kill, and utility can do things like allowing you more support items to equip to use during combat and such. Odd levels allow you for your class unlocks. It's kind of like the class talents, but the talents are more passives, whereas class unlocks is more skill button oriented. The way you level up is by gaining experience points, or XP. You can get XP from a number of different sources, like getting information on enemies in your bestiary, completing quests, or even just getting past scripted events. However, XP is distributed evenly among all your companions. The less companions you have in your party, the faster you can level. It's kind of the catch in having more survivability through numbers. It's another thing that players of this series look at when planning new playthroughs. You also have the ability to hire adventurers from inns. When you hire an adventurer, you create the character from scratch in the character creator, just like you did for your character. This gives the player the ability to form any type of party they want. If they want to go through the game with a full party of 6 fighters, they can. If someone wanted more than 1 priest in their party to heal with, they can. It costs money to hire them, but they function just like normal companions you find in the game. The only things they don't have is a companion quest or opinions on anything. Weapons and armor also help out in a variety of ways. From things like more damage on your enemies, to more damage reduction, and even more points into certain skills and attributes. What you wear and what it has enchanted on it work in your benefit in pretty much every way listed above. You can get a cape that adds more perception onto your character, making it so you can hit that perception check that you just missed earlier. Having a burning enchantment on your weapon adds a bit of fire damage to the enemies when you attack. You can also enchant these weapons and armor at your leisure. Raise their quality rating, adding in a certain damage type, or even making it so they do bonus damage to certain types of enemies. It's yet another system in this game that adds more to its overall great package. There are also named weapons in the game. They're pretty strong right off the bat. However, you cannot enchant them. They're named weapons with a silver background to their icons. The way you get stronger is by binding the soul of the wielder and doing certain challenges. They get stronger as each challenge is completed. These are more unique and have tons of interesting lore to them. Think of them as legendary weapons. So outside of that normal gameplay there, you also get your own fort in this game called Cad Nua. It's just a little rundown. Okay, it's really rundown. Once you have it, you can spend money to fix up its really large list of issues that it has. These will add both prestige and security to your fort. You get to rest there for free, and some of the things that you fix up will allow you to choose certain resting bonuses. You get certain events that occur at Cad Nua itself. Events like your fort being attacked where you have to fight off the enemies. For something like this, you can even hire up to 8 NPCs that will help you out during combat. You can't order them around yourself, but they will fight on your side. Most of the time they end up dying on me, so I need to keep hiring new people. Other events come in that add some extra flavor to the world. You can be visited by certain NPCs that would like to talk to you. You literally sit on a throne and decide what to do with their requests. Being aggressive towards them, helping them out, sending a companion out to help them, it's a lot of choices. If you send a companion out with the NPC, they will be gone for about 5 business days. Stuff like this adds more importance to your character's role and influence in Eora. Stuff you decide on actually matters. Something else that comes with those choices is reputations with groups, cities, and factions. One of the strengths of Obsidian is their use of the reputation systems in their games. They have both positive and negative directions that your reputation with certain faction can go. But it goes further than that. They have a middle section where it combines both the positive and the negative. If you do some good and bad to a faction, they can have mixed reactions about you instead. While in Pillars 1, I didn't really see it affecting too much. I know that it affects store prices, and you can be attacked by a faction that sees you as true evil. It's something that absolutely helps to flesh out the world and give your choices more meaning and consequences to them. It may not be as in-depth and fluid as something like Fallout New Vegas' reputation system, but that's likely because this game was mainly funded on Kickstarter. When it comes to the gameplay in Pillars 1, it's evident that the developers wanted to have a lot of systems at work to really make the game they wanted to make. But you can really feel the lack of budget and time on the project, as well as some of those systems that may not be as fleshed out as Obsidian's older work. Something I hope is done on a bigger scale with the sequel, Deadfire. As far as the gameplay goes, it's very solid and makes Pillars of Eternity a great game to pick up and enjoy. While the systems may not be as fleshed out as one would hope, they're all still solid enough and only add to the experience rather than take away from it. With that done, let's talk a little about the world, setting, and the story of the game. Imagine a world, one very fantasy in design, one where the soul of a person holds great weight in how their lives go, one with reincarnation and everyone knows about it. People who can read and manipulate souls. A society built upon reading people's souls and deciding if they're okay to do anything based on their past lives' decisions. That world is Eora. Eora is a fascinating place. It's clear that Obsidian went to great lengths to not only add in the fact that souls are a huge part of the world, but also what a society with that knowledge would do with it. If you look at our world, we don't have access to viewing, reading, or controlling souls in any way. But what if we did? Would our society be similar to that of Eora? Quite possibly. It's already been confirmed that reincarnation is the thing in Eora. Because some people can view and read souls, they have groups and factions that dictate someone's life simply for what an older life of theirs did. Someone could have been a genocidal maniac in a previous life, and because of that, never have the freedom to join certain groups. It's an interesting concept that further challenges nature versus nurture in a deeper way. Sure, you can say that it's your soul, but should you personally be held accountable for something a different person did? The location the game takes place in is called Deerwood. For all I know, most of this only happens in Deerwood, though there are people from other locations entirely, and this isn't news to them. Regardless, like I said before, there are people capable of reading and seeing your soul. One of those types of people are called Watchers, something really rare it seems, as everyone makes a note of it. Watchers can see souls, interact with them, and experience bits of the soul's past. The act of experiencing their past is a one-to-one recreation of the event. Everything that happens, from actions taken like walking and running, to combat, and even to the emotions that the soul felt in that moment. The Watcher sees it all as if it's their own experience. Your character is one such Watcher. After seeing a mysterious-looking cult do something with an old machine, they have their soul awakened through some unknown means. They can now do all the stuff that Watchers can do. With their soul awakened, they can now see glimpses of one of their past lives. Now you need to find out why this happened. Overall setup aside, the story to the game is pretty good. It's got the interesting bits of being a new world to play around with ideas in, such as the souls concept. You've got a vague goal to go after, and a pretty big world to explore and go questing in. Not only that, but you're given choices all the time in this game. These choices come via dialogue and the storybook moments. Some of these choices also come from completing certain quests over others. As an example, In the second act of the game, you're introduced to 3 different factions. Depending on what quests you do for any of them will lock you out of the others. Whatever quest you end up doing will raise your reputation with that faction in question, thus making it so the other 2 won't want to deal with you. You might not be seen as evil to them, but they'll see you as an ally to their enemy. Choices and consequences are definitely Obsidian's bread and butter, but I can't help feeling that in the base game, those choices don't feel as woven and interconnected as I would have liked. In my opinion, Fallout New Vegas is still the king of choices and consequences, feeling like they not only matter, but the factions react in ways you would expect. Given that Pillars 1 was a Kickstarter game, there's some extra leeway in there. The base game's story is in 4 acts of varying sizes. You don't get big cutscenes in this game. What you get is like a storybook moment of sorts. When certain moments come up, you'll switch to a different screen where you read about what's happening. These moments harken back to older styled games where the writing helped the player imagine the various scenes. Written story moments also happen in normal dialogue as well. If you interact with someone, everyone is frozen, but the text at the bottom will tell you what's happening. The quality of writing in these moments is fantastic and easy to imagine. There's a certain feeling of those choose-your-own-adventure books with it. It's a strong story from start to finish, but also feels like it's more set up for the future of the series. Unnecessary evil in storytelling. Have to set up the world so future stories can really hit home, right? Starting out as part of Caravan, the main character gets awakened and goes off to find the one who awakened their soul. In their journey, they get their own fort called Cad Nua, with which they can use as a base of operations and lord over the land in that region. Following the various leads on that enigmatic cult, named the Leaden Key, the main character gets ever closer to getting the answers they seek. All this while there's a curse going on called Widewind's Legacy, which causes newborn children to be born without souls. The focus on souls is a very large part of the game's world and narrative. Since this is the first game in the series, this is our introduction to the various themes and storylines. There's a lot of companions that you can get, all of them different classes, and they all have their own side quests that flesh them and their stories out. Kana, the scholar chanter that's looking for a very specific tablet to see what's written on it. Adair, the witty fighter who joins you with the goal of finding out why his brother did what he did before passing away. Aloth, the seclusive wizard who has an awakened soul with another person taking control of his body from time to time. These side quests are an interesting part of the game that helps flesh out the world. You can skip these side quests and see what happens in the end credits to those characters, or you can do them to see what the world is like and get some money and experience from the effort needed. There are even locations on the map that aren't needed to complete the main quest. These locations will have their own side quests and even affect the end credits you see based on their outcome. I was personally a fan of Raderick's Hold and would recommend it. Something of note is that the DLC, The White March Parts 1 and 2, can be played whenever you want while going through the game. It's recommended you be at least level 7 before hopping in though. It's built to be played alongside the main story, so it's more new areas. And some of the information you'll learn in the DLC is brought up in the main story as well as the ending. The DLC is something special, especially Part 2. I don't know what it is with fantasy games with snow and cold, but there's such a vibe to me. That and the story is fantastic. It feels like they put more choices and consequences into the White March. Going into White March felt like the writers really found some good footing. Warring factions, world building, and even an interesting mystery of what's in the box. Your character is hired to get into an old dwarven facility called Durgan's Battery. Figuring out how to get in and how to go about it is up to the player. Part 1 has a beginning, middle, and end of its story. Part 2 picks up after resting outside the White March one time. It's a continuation of Part 1 and really adds a lot to the story in White March. Part 2 takes some of the choices the player made during Part 1 and utilizes them to great effect. Choices like letting a certain group live and they help you out in Part 2 for it. Part 2 feels like a great way to expand the story even further in ways that you didn't expect. The main character gets a vision of seeing an army and a lot of eyes looking at them. If that doesn't sound like an interesting hook, I don't know what will. I don't want to talk too much about Part 2, but just know that the story in it is really good. I'd say that about wraps things up. Pillars of Eternity is pretty good overall. It has a very interesting world, competent writing, and the gameplay is both challenging and strategic in nature. As my first experience into the world of Eora, I'd say this makes a good first impression. I'll still need to hop into Pillars 2 before Avowed comes out. I have a feeling that the story in that game will be really good, now that they have a good portion of the world building out of the way with the first game. Pillars 1 also had the limitation of having a lot of its budget coming from Kickstarter. While Pillars 2 was also crowdfunded, a lot of the groundwork was laid out with the first game. Avowed is most likely being funded through Microsoft since Xbox now owns Obsidian as a first-party developer. Because of that, not only is the gameplay going to be vastly different from Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, but his budget will be much higher than both those games, likely combined even. thank you all so much for watching. I hope you liked the video. With Pillars of Eternity out of the way, it's now onward to Pillars of Eternity 2, Dead Fire. With that said, I hope you all have a great day. Adios.